Hey folks, welcome back. This is Joel, and in this video we will actually talk about device administration, right, using ISE. Now we have talked about a lot of features of ISE in the whole series. You can go back to my channel and you can check the rest of the videos. But I thought, I think the discussion on ISE will not be complete if we not talk about device administration, because that's another very important parallel and one of the most important feature which customers use, right? So that being said, let's do a simple example today, right? But before that, let's talk a little bit about theory on what protocols are involved, why we use those, and so on. Okay, so we are on my whiteboard here. Okay, so first thing, let's talk about the protocols, right? So you probably would have already heard about the protocol which is used for network access, which is radius, right? When I say network access, I mean things like your .1x map, basically allowing the users to connect to the network, right? So that was basically a network access. What we are talking today is device administration. So the protocol which we are gonna be using is TACACS+. Okay. Now, first question, probably if you're attending some network security jobs, interviews, and so on, one of the important questions which people ask is, why do we use TACACS+? Why not use radius directly, right, for device administration as well? The reason mainly is that in case of your radius, if you look at the packet flow, right, what they do is they kind of combine the authentication and authorization in that same session, right? So the authenticator will basically send the authentication information, right, the username, password, and the radius server, which is in this case say ISE, is going to reply back with the authorization result, saying that okay, yes, your username password is correct and this is your authorization result, and that's the end of it, right? So you can't do something like one authentication, right, authenticate once, but kind of authorize multiple times, right? So you can't do that. And don't you think that is something very important when you're dealing with device administration, right? Reason, because if you try to think of some of the most important protocols which we use for device admins are what? SSH, Telnet, right? These are the protocols which we use for remote access, right, of any of your Cisco CLI devices for connecting to the CLI. Now, it would be a really terrible experience if I ask the user to authenticate for, let's say, every single show command he or she is typing, right? So that is basically what radius is. I mean, you can technically use radius as well. I'm not saying you can't use it. Technically you can use it, but the experience will not be that great, right? Because it combines your authentication, authorization. You will basically be prompted basically every single action, right, is going to be authorized one after the other. So if you say have to run 5 show commands on the device, right, the best way, or basically when it is an interactive way, right, when the devices we are administering requires a bit of interaction, then the best option to go is TACACS, because in this case you have the feasibility where inside a single session you can authenticate once, and then you can keep on authorizing new requests under the same session. So the user will not even feel that he's that there's some kind of authorization happening, because he would have just authenticated once, and as and when he puts in the show command, right, in the background there'll be authorization happening, and you'll be getting the access to run those show commands, right? So yeah, so that's one thing, one important part, why we use this particular command, why we use this particular protocol. Okay, now a little bit, probably again, if you want to go a little bit deeper into this, right, just to understand the packets a little bit, right? So think of this way, you are here, right, you are a network admin in a big company, and you're sitting on your laptop and you're trying to SSH into a device, right? Which device you're trying to SSH? Maybe a switch, right? There's a switch here. That is exactly our example today. We have a switch and we are trying to authenticate the network admin into the switch, right? And then you have your ISE here sitting. Okay, how does everything start, right? So let's try to roll through this packet flow, right? So you have a SSH initiated from your laptop. Okay, So now we are inside the authentication, say authentication domain, right? We are going to start the authentication now. So there is a SSH request coming in, and your device which is here, it will have certain configuration which we'll look into, right? But basically what it will do is it will start a TACACS session, right, authentication session, and it will start a session and it will say to the ISE, hey, look, someone is trying to connect. The ISE is gonna promptly come back and say, okay, good, that's fine, give me the username, right? And there you go, the username is going to be sent, right? And that's how you would have seen in the prompt on your CLI, on your SSH client CLI, right? It will ask you for the username, right? So you put in the username, and the username is basically sent here up to the ISE, right? Then again, there will be another request saying, okay, I got the username, now can you send me the password? And there you go, you send the password again. Okay, so all of this is done, right? So now obviously on the ISE you can do different ways, right? You can either authenticate this user against some internal stores, right, where you have the username and password configured locally on the ISE, or you can do some external authentication using some AD, right? But whatever it is, at this point we are good, right? So this guy is gonna say, hey, awesome, so your username is good, we are gonna call it a day. I mean, we're gonna allow you inside now, right? Because the authentication has succeeded. So that was the auth part over here. Okay, now next what happens? So this is the cool thing, right? So once the authentication happens, now we can do multiple authorizations. Now in case of Cisco devices, we call it we have couple of two authorizations which are super important. One is the shell authorization, the other one is the command authorizations, right? And that's mainly for Cisco devices, but for other devices as well, you have, like for Nexus and so on, you have different a bit differently, but the basic funda is the same, right? So let's talk a little bit more on the Cisco iOS devices. So the next thing what's going to happen is, what's the user trying to do here? SSH. So he's trying to SSH into the shell, right? So there will be a new request sent. Use a different color. Oh, that's bad. Give me a second, let me fix that. All right. So yeah, so we're done with authentication. Now, like I said, we have the next section, which is basically nothing but the authorization. So the first thing, like we call it, it's called as, either you can call it as exec authorization or shell authorization, right? Basically trying to get that CLI, trying to get that shell, right, of the device. So another request is basically sent, right? It is basically an authorization request, not an authentication request. It's authorization now, right? And in the request, it will, if you look at the packet, right, it will basically have it as service equals shell, right? So it will request for a shell access, right? And if this user basically has permission to look at the shell or get the shell, then that will be authorized, and the shell will be provided, or basically the shell is basically provided based on the policies which you have configured on the ISE, right? For simplicity, let's assume that it is configured and everything is good, so you're going to get the shell access. So this, I would say, completes the second stage, right? And this is, what is this? This was the shell authorization. Very important when you're talking about Cisco iOS devices, right? You're getting the shell. So what you have done here we have authenticated, and then we have started the authorization. Step number 1 of authorization is shell authorization, and which we completed now. Next would be the this is where TACACS becomes really cool, right? If this was the only job, then I could have done with Radius as well, right? That is authenticating and getting one authorization. I could have done it with Radius as well. But then TACACS is really good because now I can do multiple authorizations. Which is the next authorization? Command-based authorization, right? So command-based authorization. One second, yeah. So command-based authorization is super important because you would want to monitor and you would want to allow only certain users to run certain commands, correct? So maybe you have a user whom you want to allow, say, only show run, right? You don't want that user to run any other kind of command. So basically you can do all of that, right? So now this is basically a new authorization request on the same session, right? Mind it, this is all in the same session. I'm not creating separate TACACS sessions. It's the same session. I've authenticated once, I've gotten the shell authorization, which means I've obtained the shell, and now I can say I can go to my shell and I can say show run, right? And that will basically go as what? In the request, it will go as service equals whatever the command you want to sell, right? So in this case, show run, right? The command will be sent to ISE, and ISE is going to look in its policy and it's going to say, okay, this user is authorized to run this command, right? And then it is going to approve that, right? It's going to authorize it, and that's when the switch is going to allow the user to run that command, right? So, and then obviously I've left out the accounting part, but basically, over here and here, right, once the shell authorization occurs, once the command authorization occurs, at these points you can actually start accounting as well. That way, you can keep a track of who has been authorized and what they are doing on the devices. We'll look at that part maybe when we are doing the configuration, but yeah, so that's mainly a little overview of how the whole thing plays out. And again, I just want to double click here. I want to say why we use TACACS Plus is mainly because of this, right? It's one authentication, multiple authorizations, and and that's where TACACS really comes alive, and that's where it is really different when you talk about Radius, right? And you can do all of this in one single session, which really simplifies the job, right? For both the configuration side of things as well as on the user experience side of things, right? From a user experience, I will not even feel that there is some authorization being happening in the background, right? I will basically be on this SSH shell and I will blindly go about running my commands, and all of this would be happening in the background. Okay. So what else? The other thing I think you probably already know about this is like basic, I would say CCNA stuff, which we kind of learn when we are very new to probably routers and switches. But the privilege levels, right? Again, this is for Cisco iOS, right? For different platforms, you'll have to just look it up. But for Cisco iOS, when you talk about, right, we have something called as privilege levels, right? So privilege levels are basically, it allows you to, these are different levels, right? Different authorization, I would say, levels on the device, right? Or you can also call them as modes, right? And with these different modes, you can do certain different jobs, right? You're authorized to do certain things. Now the most common ones are what? 0, 1 and 15. Okay. 0 is, I would say, useless, doesn't have anything. I mean, I think you can run probably 2 or 3 commands like help and maybe log out or enable, right? So these are the commands only you can run, right? Not really useful, right? It's what do you say, the most minimum power. It's like the powerless mode, right? Then we have what we call as the user mode, right? So in this mode, you basically can again run some very simple commands, right? Things on the top of my mind are like ping and telnet and SSH, right? And maybe few show commands, very few, right? So that's basically very few show commands though, okay? And that's your shell, that's your user mode, right? That's privilege number 1. Privilege 15 is the privilege exec mode, right? And if you look at this, right, I don't know if you see on the top, maybe not, okay. So you'll basically have, if this is your host name of the switch, it will have a hash here at the end, right? So when you see the hash, it means that you are in the privilege 15, right? Whereas in privilege 1, you will have something like this. You'll have switch as the host name, and you'll have one, greater than arrow mark of this sort, right? So that would mean you're in privilege 1. Okay. So this is important because this really comes handy. If you know these privilege levels, this is how you can decide what privilege you want to assign to a user who is trying to authenticate, right? If it's a network admin, right, probably a network admin who wants access to the whole set of commands on the device, right? In that case, you can give him privilege 15, right? Whereas if there is some kind of a help desk kind of person, right, who really whom you are not going to trust your devices with, so but then he wants to do some ping or some non-intrusive show commands, then probably you can give him, right, privilege 1. So and then I just covered 0, 1 and 15, but there is obviously between 2 and 14, right? You call this as something like customized privilege levels, and you have the privilege to configure whatever you want in this, right? So you can create a privilege level 2 and you can provide what are the rights of this, what commands you want to run as part of this, and so on. So you can you can define it. It's a custom privilege levels, right? So yeah, many organizations, they do this, right? But I will also show you probably just by giving privilege 15 to everyone, still you can control what show commands they can run by using ISE. So I'll show you that as well. But there are two ways to do it. Either you can probably create a custom privilege level every time, right? And you can create a custom privilege level for different role in your company, like help desk and whatnot, and you can you can just give that privilege level as authorization result, right, when the user is authenticated. Or the other approach is give everyone privilege 15, but then you can specify which commands they can run or not run, right? So that couple of approaches. Anyway, so these are a couple of things which I wanted to just get out of the way, like very basic stuff, before we get to the configuration part, right? So so this is my switch, right? What topology we have here? Nothing complicated. I think what we have here is we have the switch, right? A cat 9K switch we have, and think of it as, just don't worry about the topology, physical topology as such. I want to just give you the glimpse of the logical topology, because I've just simulated everything inside, apart from the switch, everything is inside a UCS box, right? So, but what is important for us is the switch and the ISE. Okay, so there is connectivity between switch and the ISE, right? And what we are trying to do is think of it as there is a client here. Okay, there is a client here who is trying to SSH into the box, SSH into the switch. Okay, so how are we taking care of the device administration? How are we allowing which user to connect and what privileges and all of that? So this is what we are trying to do, right? Technically, this host is also inside the UCS. So in my topology, physical topology, the ISE and the host are in the same UCS box, but yeah, just the logical topology is important for us. So this is how it is, right? So the PC here, the user who is sitting here, right, has IP connectivity to the switch, right? So he's trying to SSH to it, and when the SSH comes into play, right, the switch basically uses TACACS, talks to the ISE, and the whole workflow goes along. So we'll look into how to configure this. Okay, so two things here. There is configuration to be done on the ISE side, as well as there is configuration to be done on the switch side. So let's see how do we get both of those things done. So let's look at the ISE side first. Let's go to our, there we go. So that's my ISE. Okay, before looking at ISE, let me also show you my Active Directory, right? So in my Active Directory, I've created a group called All IT, right? The IT folks. And then as part of this, there are 3 members, right? A typical just names, right? So there are 3 members. One username is called as Cisco, other one is network admin, other one is sec admin. So these 3 are part of this group called All IT, and we'll be using this group to do our testing today. Okay. That being said, let's get to where is the device administration. So you go to work centers and you have a separate tab here for device administration. That's it. You can come down here and your job is done. Like everything is laid out to you here on the top, right? So starting from the first thing, deployment, right? Like now some of these configurations are already done, and or some of them are already by default out there. So I'm still going to go through each of these, right? So that you don't miss out if you're trying to redo the same lab. That being said, we come down to overview and go to the deployment side here, right? And so this is the place where you can enable your device administration. Right now, in my case, I have a single ISE node, so I'm basically gonna say only the specific node, and I have enabled this, right? Or you can enable the device administration on all the policy service nodes as well, right? Wait, before that, let me also show you the licensing part. So maybe that might be another question you might have. What license do we need for this, right? So when you talk about TACACS, right, the licensing is, or when you talk about device administration, the licensing is more like per PSN, right? So if you see device admin enabled over here, that's it. It's like the license is more like per PSN, right? Per PSN, so per node basis, right? And if you see admin enabled here, and you can see here TACACS, and you can see consumption count 1, right? So it's enabled. So that should be fine. Now coming back again, so we looked at that deployment, and we enabled the device administration for our ISE, right? It's already enabled for us. You can change the ports if needed. I'm using the default 49, but you can change if needed. Next is you need to add that switch to where? You need to add the switch to your NAD, right? The network devices basically. So you can go to network resources here. If you want, you can create a group here first, network group, device groups, right? To kind of device groups can be used actually later in the policies and so on. So if you want, you can create separate device groups. Now I think by default the ISE ships with some device groups like all device types, and you will have switches in that. Since I'm doing this TACACS for a switch, I already have it, so I don't have to create anything. So you can happily go to network devices and you can click on add and add your device. Now in my case, this is the device, the distribution switch, which has been added, and you can see the IP address is here 172.16. Let me just copy that for future use. So 172.16.15.1. Now in my case, the NAD is already added because you would have seen me doing .1x and MAB and all of that in the previous videos. So it's already added. I've already enabled TACACS on it, but let me go through these things again, right? So IP address, let's close the radius part. Radius is not needed at all for this particular lab. You're gonna just do the TACACS, right? And in the TACACS, you will have to put a shared secret, right? This is kind of like mainly for authentication purpose. So you need to put a shared secret here, and you have to copy the same thing on the device as well, right? I have put something which is very specific to this one, right? Where local user credential, right? Now there's a button here called enable single connect mode, right? So what that means is, so to kind of optimize TACACS, right, what they have done is there is this cool feature, right? The single connect, what it does is your authentication, authorization, accounting, right? All the three requests, right, will kind of work in the same TCP session, right? So if this feature is supported, provided, right? So not all network devices support it. So if your device is supporting it, great, go and enable it and use it. But I'm not going to enable it now, but if you want, you can try it out. But what it really does is, I mean, the protocol is still the same. It's just that, you know, instead of having three separate TCP sessions for each of your authentication, authorization, accounting, we are going to just have only one session, right? And we are going to piggyback all the other requests in the same TCP session. So that's the meaning of that. So basically, if you imagine, if you have a lot of devices authenticating into your ISE, you wouldn't want a lot of TCP sessions, right? So if you can reduce them in any way, it's always better. So you can use this. Apart from that, forget about SNMP. So I think that's mainly it. So you need to enable it, and you need to enable TACACS and go and put in the shared credentials. And yeah, so that's mainly about the network device. Identities, I'm not going to get to this in this video because, you know, it's not very relevant, but just to show it to you, you can add a local username password right here into the ISE, and you can use this for authentication. Or in my case, I would have used external ID, right? External, sorry, not this one. External ID sources. You can see here we are using the Mango AD, which I showed you earlier, right? This one. This is the Mango AD, which I've already connected in the previous video. So I think 2-3 videos back, right, where we talked, I think maybe in the initial video itself I showed how you can connect a AD to ISE, so you can go and check it. But I have been using this AD for all the other videos as well, for doing .1x, MAB and BYOD and guest portal and all of that, right? So we are going to continue using that. But you have option, like I said, to use some local credentials or local identities in case if you don't have an AD, or if you're doing a lab and you don't really have time to set up the whole AD, you can use a local credential. So that's done. Now the only things remaining is the policy part. Okay. All right. So when we talk about policy, again, it's very, if you have done .1x, it's pretty similar to that. Slight subtle changes here and there. So let's look at that, right? So when you come to the policy elements, scroll down to the results, right? And you will see there are two important pieces here. One is called TACACS command set, and another one is called TACACS profiles. Let's look at TACACS profile first, right? Actually, these two pieces kind of constitute to what we call as the your authorization profiles which you have, right? The normal authorization profiles, right, which you probably would have used while doing the other labs. Or let me actually go and show you that. So you go to maybe let's go to policy. Can I open this in new? Yeah, there we go. Let's open the results. Yeah, so here, see, you would have seen under the left side here, you would have seen the authorization profiles, right? You would have done a bunch of configurations here for BYOD or maybe for redirecting and all of that, right? So your authorization profiles. Basically, these are the authorization results which are given out, once the authentication is succeeded. So very similar to that for device administration, you do all of that stuff in these two things, right? Which is TACACS profiles and TACACS command sets. Now, what does TACACS profile do? So it comes with some default, and I think maybe there are a couple of these which I've added while playing around, but they come with some default stuff, I think. Let's look at probably one of these, which we'll actually use. We'll not create anything new, we'll use the default ones, but you have provision to create new here, right? Let's look at the one which we have already. So we have one TACACS profile which is called priv 15 shell profile. So what this does is, technically, if you're trying to do this TACACS authentication for your enterprise, right, what I would suggest is create different profiles based on the job role, right? So if you have someone probably from help desk who might log into the switch and check certain things, right? Maybe they might want to run a very basic show command, maybe show version, right? Maybe it's a help desk center or someone, so they shouldn't be given access to run config commands, correct? They should be given access to run something very basic. So in that case, what you can do is you can create different profiles for different roles. It could be network admin, sec admin, and help desk person, or maybe a solution architect, whatnot, right? You can create different profiles. And once you create a profile, here you can see the common task type. So you can see this is what I was talking about. For iOS X, you use shell, but similarly for WLC, Nexus, and other products, you can use accordingly different ways to get to the shell, right? Basically the different drop downs. We are talking about Cisco iOS XE, so we are going to stick to shell. Now this is the default privilege, right? And this is the maximum privilege they can get. Now in my case, I'm just enabling all of this only for my network admins, are basically the IT folks. I'm going to give privilege 15 for everyone, but you can put whatever you want here. You can put 1, you can put 2, whatever is the default privilege which you want, right? Further, you can also add few more things. You can put in ACL, right? Only from a certain IP subnet you can allow access, or you can put an auto command. When you put an auto command, what happens is as soon as the user is authenticated, that's the first command which will be run, like show run or something, right? You can put that. You can enable no escape, in which case the user will not be able to press the escape key in case of certain actions which he or she is trying to do. So you have privileges to play around with that. And whatever you do here in this drop downs, if you go to the raw view, you can see these are the attributes which will be actually sent in the authentication request, right? Or basically the TACACS authorization request, right? As a reply, this is what is going to be sent, right? Now in my case, I'm gonna, like I said, keep this, which is basically privilege 15, and you can see that's the TACACS profile. Now there's one more thing important called as TACACS command set, right? So this again comes with default, right? Couple of these deny all commands and permit all commands. Let's look at the permit all commands. Okay. So yeah, so you have created, for now what you have done is you have created the TACACS profile based on different roles, right? Now what you can do is you can create command sets. So command sets allow you to define which commands the users can run, right? Now this is exactly what I was talking about earlier, right? There are two approaches. One is, in one approach, I can simply create different privilege levels for different users or different roles, but that's too hectic, right? I have to do that configuration on all the switch, and if I have to do some changes, I'll have to do it on every single switch. Instead of that, what you can do is you can give privilege 15 to every user, but at the same time here, right, in the TACACS command set, you can create different command sets, right? Like in my case, I have permit all commands, right? But in your case, you can create command sets only for help desk people, command sets only for network admins, sec admins, and so on, right? So you can keep on basically add a row here. You can put the permit command, you can write the command name, and you can list out the commands which you want the user to run, or the ones which you want to allow them to run, right? You can also check this box here. You can see permit any command that is not listed below, right? So if you keep on listing the show commands here, those commands will not be allowed. So you can do both, right? You can do, especially you can allow a user to run specific commands, or in this fashion, right? If I click this, what happens is you'll basically allow them to run everything except the ones listed here, right? So you can play around with the combinations. I'm going to cancel that. I'm going to keep all commands for now. So these are the two important things which you gotta do. And this is, like I said, is more like authorization profiles in case if you're .1x and map. Now the next is the policy sets, right? This view is familiar to you guys, but don't confuse this with the other policy sets which we have for network access, right? That one you will basically get it from here, where you go to policy set. There you go, right? So this is the policy set which you get for that, but here you can see this is a different one. So yeah, anyway, so we are on the policy sets for what? For device administration, and there's one default which is already added, right? You can use the plus button here and add more. Maybe you can add if you want to add a separate policy set with your own name for different customized one, you can add it. I'm going to use the default one. Remember to use in the drop down, right, the allowed protocols, you should use default device admin, right? So that's important. And what does that actually relate to? So what does this actually relate to? You can actually come back to policy elements. You can go to results, allowed protocols, and there you go, right? There you go. This is what it actually relates to. So because you have selected that, these are the protocols. These are the authentication protocols which are allowed inside TACACS, right? So you can, in my case, all are selected. In your case, if they are not selected, better select it and then try it once again, right? Okay, so coming back, so that's the allowed protocol, and make sure you have selected the one where you have allowed your TACACS. So that's this one. Click on that and you would basically get the authentication policy. Again, in my case, I'm not gonna change anything here, not needed, because there's a default authentication policy, and my whole idea is to allow users who are part of the Mango corporate AD, right? So that's why you've seen the drop down. I have selected internal and Mango users, so that's good. And once the authentication succeeds, authorization is remaining, right? So that's where we will do the configuration. Now I already have something here for my WLC, so I'm gonna probably create something here. Actually, I have everything almost. What I can do is probably just duplicate this below, right? So let's duplicate that, and I'm gonna remove this WLC here, right? Let's actually click on this just to show you what we have done. We'll actually remove WLC. WLC is not needed. But what we are doing here is, one of the condition which we are using is the TACACS managed device, right? Let's click on edit and let's look at that. You can see here, this is a condition which will be true if the request is coming as a TACACS request. And the second condition is basically nothing but I'm checking that if the user is part of this group which I showed you earlier called as all IT, right? So if the user is part of Mango AD and which group, which specific group. So in my case, I know that all my IT folks in this particular fictional organization are part of this group, which is all IT, right? Let's click on that and there you go, members, right? These are the three guys. So that's why I've selected this, okay? So yeah, so that's, let me actually, okay, I forgot to delete it, delete that, use, okay? So there you go. So we are going to say permit, and you can add any more conditions you want based on your organization needs. In my case, I'm going to just use that, right? Now, command sets, see, these are the two things, right? The profiles and the command sets which we used earlier. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say permit all commands, correct? Because that's the command set which we looked at, and if this condition satisfies, I want those users to get all the access to run any commands, right? So that's why I'm selecting that. And for shell profiles, what profile? Remember we looked at the default profile which was 15, so I'm going to give 15, right? So that's good. Let's save that. Okay, so I think that should take care of all the configurations needed on the ISE side. Now we are good to go and do the configuration on the switch side. Okay, on the switch side, let's come back to our secure CRT here. Okay, so I'm on the console of this switch. Okay, so that's how I have connected to this guy. So let's put in the Okay, there you go. So that's fine. So I'm in the console. Okay, this is not a remote session. I'm on the console of the box. Okay, so before we configure something new, let's look at what is already configured. Yeah, there you go. So show run section AAA. Right, so I'm on the console on the box, and we can see there's a bit of radius stuff which we used for our earlier labs like .1x and map. Don't worry about that. There is also a authentication list pointing to none, which means there is no authentication being provided as part of this list. And I think just by looking at it, you can understand that it has been applied to the console line, because I don't want any authentication, any authorization to happen on the console. So that is enabled here, especially I put none. The next one is also for .1x. Don't worry, we are not doing any .1x in this one. We also have authorization which is pointing to none, right? Which is again for the line console 0, which is being put there because we don't want any authorization on console as well. The next two lines are again pertaining to .1x. Don't worry about that, and this is for CUI, right? So we really don't have any TACACS based configuration on the box. So let me actually pull out my config here just to show it to you guys. I've already put it in a file so that it's easier for us to configure it. And what do we have here? So the configuration which needs to go in is, the very first part is your TACACS configuration, right? You need to tell the switch how to reach the TACACS server. So you give a name to the TACACS server, like here I've given a random name, put in the IP address of the TACACS server and put the secret, right? The TACACS secret which we configured on the ISE side. Next is you enable AAA new model, right? Very straightforward. I think you probably would have done that 100 times by now. The next is create a server list, right? Now this is done because in my case really doesn't matter, because I just have one TACACS server or one ISE server. But in case in a production environment you have multiple TACACS servers, then what you can do is you can create a group list like this, right? You can create a group list. In my case, the name I've given is ISE_TACACS, and you can keep on adding all the TACACS servers which you have under this, right? So it will give you some kind of a high availability. Even if one ISE server dies, the next one will pick it up, and you will basically have redundancy. Next would be the authentication section. Okay, so the authentication section, you see here the authentication login console is none, right? Because I do not want to put any authentication on this. But look at the first line here. So we have authentication login, and you see the name. I'm using the default name, right? You can give any name you want. You can give VTY, blah, blah, any name, right? But for this particular list, I'm using the default name. The reason I'm using this default is because if you're using the default, then you don't have to explicitly apply it under the line, right? Line VTY, it will get applied automatically. So I'm using the default name here, and then you need to attach the group, the TACACS groups. What is the name of the group? We just created it above here, right? ISE_. So that's one which we have attached. What is the use of this word local? The reason is it's a fallback method, right? So in case your TACACS is not reachable, then it will fall back to local. Okay, so that completes these two lines, and then we have also enabled authentication for the enable as well, right? So when you do enable, normally you can either configure it locally, right, like an enable password or enable secret. What I want to do is I want the user to put his password again as a enable password, right? So that's what we have enabled here. So we are saying authentication enable, and for enable also use the group which is ISE TACACS group, and if that fails, then use the local enable password, right? So that's what we are doing there. So that's all the authentication part. Let's go to the authorization next. Now in the authorization, there are two parts to it, right? One is the shell access, the second one is the command authorization. Remember, go back to the flow chart or the flows which I was talking at the start of the video. That's what I'm talking about here. So this is wherever you see AAA authorization exec, that means that command is pertaining to the shell access, right? Getting the SSH shell, getting the telnet shell, right? The shell part. And there also I'm basically pointing it to the same TACACS server, and I'm fallback is local and if authenticated. So I'm basically, what I'm doing here is I'm basically telling the switch, look, the authorization for this particular TACACS session is going to be controlled by the ISE, which is present as part of this group, right? So that's what we are doing there. Again, for the console, I'm just putting it as pointing to none because I don't want any authorization to be done on the console. So that's the exec part. Now the commands. So observe this command here. There is authorization config commands. Why this is basically used is because we want to enable users, right? The users who are connecting to our shell, they should be able to configure some commands also if needed, right? So we are enabling that. They should not be just going and doing show commands, but because these are network admins, right, IT staff, we want to give them the privilege to configure commands as well, right? So we are going to enable that, and then you can see the last two commands here. In my network, I'm basically expecting people to come either with privilege 1 or 15, right? Actually in the policy sets we have not considered privilege 1, but in case in future if I want to add privilege 1, so what I've done here is we are enabling two commands, and using these commands we are enabling the users who are coming with these privilege levels to be able to use the configure commands, right? So that's why we have the sorry, not just the configure commands, any commands. We are allowing them to run any kind of commands, and that's why we have attached it to both privilege level number 1 and privilege level number 15, right? And again, it will be determined by whom? The ISE itself, right? The ISE is the one who is going to tell us which commands the user can run. So all of that is going to be obtained as part of the TACACS replies, right? But what we are doing on the switches, we are just telling the switch that, look, your authorization will be controlled by the ISE, right? The commands which the users are going to run on the switch are going to be controlled by the ISE. So all of that information we are providing to the switch using this configuration. And the last part is the accounting part, right? So we have put an accounting command and attached it to exec, because we want to account for exec related activities, correct? We want to see who got authorized, right? Who got authorized to the shell, right? So that information we would want to see in the ISE logs. We also want to see, once they got authorized, what kind of commands did they run, right? So that is why accounting is enabled for that as well, right? So what I'm going to do quickly is grab all of this, right, and put it on my switch. Okay, that went well. So now we should be able to test this out, correct? So let's go back to our guy here, right? I'm gonna close that, and let's try to do a open putty here. Okay, so before opening putty, let's also go to our TACACS logs. Where are the TACACS logs? I think it's here, live logs. Okay. So there you go. So we have the this is radius, my bad. Let's go to TACACS logs. Okay, and the other one is what's the IP address? Let's grab the IP address from the NAD, right? I earlier grabbed it, but I think I've lost it. So let's grab it again. There you go. So it's nothing but that's the IP address we need to do the SSH to, right? So let's do it. So let's put in the IP address. This is normal putty, right? And port number is 22. I'm going to say open. Okay, I'm going to log in with what? Cisco, because we saw that Cisco is a part of that group, right? First time I'm going to put a wrong password, right? Just for the sake of it, I want to generate some log, right? There you go. Put a wrong password, and there you go. It's saying access denied, right? So which is fine. It worked correctly. Now what I'll do is, let me put the correct password. So I'm going to say at 1 2 3. Okay, there you go. So I put the correct password, and it allowed me inside, right? So it's already directly put me in which privilege number 15, right? Because that's what we defined in the TACACS profiles. And I can do anything. I can do config and blah blah, right? I can do anything. Now let's go and observe here what has happened. Okay, so let's do a refresh. Okay, there you go, right? So I intentionally did a wrong, I put in the wrong password because I wanted to generate this log, right? You can see here, this is my first attempt. Let's click on this and see what it tells us, right? It tells us, there you go, the authentication failed. Why? Because the user authentication against the Active Directory failed since the user entered the wrong password, correct? So that's what we did. We did this intentionally so that we generate this log, and you can see the log is very detailed, right? If you see on the right hand side, you can see the very next one succeeded, right? This is the one which succeeded, which is fine. Past authentication, and the reason is, you see on the right hand side the authentication policy which it has hit, and so that was the authentication request, right? And then you see the subsequent authorization here on the top. So we have the authorization here. We've got the and you can see here the very first authorization is nothing but what? The shell authorization, right? And you can see it has hit the priv 15 shell profile, correct? And then after that, once that is done, we are basically provided access to run any kind of show commands, which is nothing but permit all commands, right? This is the TACACS command set, and this is the TACACS shell profiles, right? The profiles which we talked about while setting it up, right? Now I should be able to run anything. I can run any show command if needed. I can run show version, say, right? And blah blah, right? So I can do all of that, and everything is gonna work because I have obtained the I've been authorized to do that, right, as part of this permit all commands, correct? So that's as simple as, you know, to do device administration with ISE, right? What I've done is I've simplified this a bit, but obviously you can do much more cool stuff. You can also probably go to reports and you can see your reports as well. Like for example, I can go to reports, device administration, go to authentication summary, and you can see, you know, probably 18 authentications have passed and 7 of them have failed, right? So you can get all of that information, right? But just to double click again, the most important part here was what? These two pieces, right? Let's go back to that just to double click. So in the in the policy elements, the two important things you need to remember is, one is the TACACS command set and the other one is the TACACS profiles, right? The profiles is the place where you kind of define the roles, depending on different roles of your organization. You define the different privilege levels the user is going to be put in as soon as, or the shell is going to provide you as soon as they authorize. And then in the command sets, you can define what exact commands you want to allow them, right? In my case, I've allowed permit all commands, so as a result of that, it is going to allow me to run any commands. But you can especially define specific commands which you want to run, and that way you know, you can prevent some people from running certain commands, right? Cool. So that was mainly device administration, guys. Pretty simple. Hope you guys explore more on it. Thanks for watching and have a good one. Bye.